Welcome to a bonus episode of the Blooms Barnacles podcast. I am here today with a fantastic guest. Zoe Patterson is a PhD candidate at Trinity College, Dublin in the School of English. I had the pleasure of meeting Zoe when I was in Glasgow this summer at the International James Joyce Symposium. I've already forgotten the number. I talked to Zoe quite a bit then and got to see her give a talk related to her thesis, which I think is going to be very much of interest to all of our listeners because I think it's how most of us kind of met each other. And, I guess I'll start by saying, welcome to Blooms and Barnacles. We're so happy to have you here. And now to get into business, your research is about Joycean community groups, reading groups, things of that nature. Tell me a little bit about your research.
Yeah, so, like you just said, my research is on Joycean communities. So that's specifically looking at non-academic Joycean communities. So those are things like reading groups, book clubs, but also things like Blooms Day, or, social media groups such as like Facebook groups where people discuss Joyce, that kind of stuff. So really any forum in which people engage with Joyce in a non-academic setting. There is a bit of a caveat to that because I say non-academic, but in reality, when you engage with these reading groups, or, you go to a Blooms Day event, or you're even on like r/James Joyce, there are academics there often. And if they're not there mingling with the non-academic readers, then the non-academic readers are often using academic resources, whether that's books, articles, podcasting, things produced by academics, either for other academics or for non-academic readers. So I say non-academic reading groups, but it's not quite non-academic. So I'm looking at a few different things with these groups. First of all, I'm looking at sort of why does Joyce's work lend itself so well to being read in a group. So obviously book clubs are just a massive thing everywhere in the modern age, and most book clubs, read a wide variety of writers. And it's usually that, you go home, read a book on your own, and then you go discuss it, and then you pick a new book, that kind of thing. But there are also book clubs where, they only read one writer. And these kinds of clubs exist for multiple writers, but they exist in a very high concentration for Joyce. I don't know the numbers on it, but I'd say it's far more likely you're gonna find a larger concentration of Joyce reading groups than you are, say, like Dickens reading groups. Not that there aren't Dickens reading groups out there, but there are just a lot of Joyce groups. This is also an international phenomenon, so people assume that like all of this would be going on in Ireland. Joyce both being Irish and his books being very, very about Dublin, but you can actually find Joyce reading groups everywhere, mostly in the Anglophone world, but also outside of it as well. So this is sort of a worldwide thing. And I'm also interested in the unique approach that these reading groups often take. Oftentimes, like I said, with book clubs, you read the book on your own and then you show up and discuss it. Sometimes people will do that with Joyce groups, but what often ends up happening instead is groups get together and they read the text aloud to one another and discuss it right after doing that kind of thing. So it's a bit of a different format to the conventional book club. So I'm looking at why Joyce for this sort of mode of reading, like what about Joyce really lends itself to this? And I'm looking at what these groups sort of do for non-academic readers. So something I'm looking at a lot is Joycean difficulty and why we perceive Joyce as difficult, that kind of thing. And how do these groups sort of demonstrate that? How do they provide support for that kind of thing? How do we decide that a text is difficult? Why is Joyce difficult? And I'm also looking at the relationship between these communities and the Joycean academic community, because obviously there is a Joyce scholarly community and they discuss the texts in certain ways that are sometimes quite different from the way non-academic groups discuss the texts, but there's also a lot of overlap. The two camps sort of have an interesting, complex relationship where they overlap a lot, but there is tension there. So I'm also sort of looking at that and thinking about how we can improve that relationship in the areas where it could use improvement, sort of how both groups can benefit one another, that kind of thing. So sorry, that was very rambly.
No,
but
it's great.
Kind of looking at a lot of different avenues with this.
Yeah. I'll start with kind of just a basic overview question, what is the average Joyce community like in terms of demographics, gender, age, nationality, location, things like that? Is there an average Joyce group or?
Yes and no. So Joyce groups, in terms of nationality, like I said before, these groups are everywhere, but they tend to be more concentrated in the Anglophone world. So there are a lot in Ireland, there are a lot in the UK, there are a lot in the US. There tends to be that Anglophone bias, even though it's not an exact thing. In terms of other demographics, this is not a universal, but from what I've noticed, the average age of the groups tends to be a bit older. A lot of that I personally think is because older people tend to be retired, have more time for things like Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake. People who are younger, especially if they're in college, in grad school, whatever, there's also the phenomenon of, university reading groups where it's like outside of a class, but it's still within a university setting. Younger people may be drawn more to that just because of, where they are in life. Definitely trends older, but that's not an absolute. In terms of gender, it really varies by group. I've noticed I haven't seen a lot of groups that are like very noticeably dominated by women, but I've seen some that are definitely have been a bit more male, but then a lot tend to have a good mix in terms of gender. Am I forgetting any big demographic areas there? So it really varies. But I would definitely say trends towards native English speakers, trends toward older generally. So yeah.
I have to say none of that is surprising to me in the least. Cool. I'm very interested in this tension between the non-academic and the academic groups. Do you think that the kind of general makeup of the academic population, is it pretty similar to the kind of hobbyist groups or enthusiast groups? Does the typical professional Joycean look pretty similar to the hobbyist Joycean, or is there a difference there?
I'd say so. I'd say, like, obviously there's a bit of a difference in the age demographics, just because if you're doing this as a career, you're going to kind of have people of all ages. So there's less of a trend towards older, but there still are a lot of older scholars, that kind of thing. Yeah, I'd say I found the demographics to be somewhat similar. Definitely more young people, but again, I think that's just because, like, in terms of being in the Joycean world, there just are more young people who are, like, doing their PhD or early career scholars versus, young people who are at that age who have the time to just do a Joyce reading group just because. Somewhat similar, but not exact.
Okay. So I'm very interested in your question of what is it about Joyce that lends itself to this type of reading group, because it will surprise no one to know I have been in a multitude of reading groups. The first time the only time I first read Twilight because it was the book for a reading group. But yeah, like that when you're gonna read the book at home and then you come and meet in the library and fight with the other women about Edward and Bella and things like that. So what has always marked the difference in any Ulysses group I've been in, whether it was back in Portland or Sweeney's, is you sit and you read the text and then you talk about the text. And, I'm a former English teacher at this stage, and that's something you really debate, pedagogically. It's like, do you have the students read out loud in class? Do you have them read and then at home and just discuss? And it seems like there's something about reading it, and I'm guessing it's just because the text is quite challenging. I'm avoiding saying difficult, but it is challenging. Like, it's not Twilight. There's a lot more words in there.
Yeah.
What is it in, I certainly have some guesses and opinions, but I want to know what you've found talking to all these different groups. What is it that makes them choose to reading out loud really dominate those spaces?
So I think it's a combination of a few different things. I think the first thing, which is, something, an element of Joyce's style that's been written about quite a lot, is the musicality of it, the orality of it. He's even, cueing us to this with the Homeric bent of Ulysses. He's really drawing on sort of that ancient oral tradition of literature in his style of writing, combined with, his focus on musicality. It's one of those styles that just doesn't resonate fully until you hear it. It's like poetry in that way. I think if you were to have a poetry reading group, you'd have to do the same thing. You can't just, So I think there's that, and I think people who are intimidated by either Ulysses or Finnegan's Wake, because I'm looking sort of at groups for both, because those are the really popular texts with groups. People who are intimidated by it, who just see it and just see like this block of text that looks scary, when they hear it, it brings it to life. It gets people excited about it. Hearing people read it, hearing people act it, makes it fun for people. So I think that's a big one. I think as well, to less so the reading aloud and more, the reading collectively, is the encyclopedic nature of both Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake. Joyce basically, with both those books, more so with The Wake, but with Ulysses as well, basically wrote two unsolvable novels. It's kind of a tangent, but I will bring it back. There's sort of an infinite amount of puzzle solving you can do with both books. Infinite amount of rabbit holes you can go down. I think a lot of people, they go into Joyce thinking that like, I need to solve as much of it as possible, and that's the whole point. But I think at least part of the point of both of those books is that you have to be comfortable with not knowing everything, not understanding everything. And it's not just being comfortable with it, it's finding it fun. You have to like find fun in feeling a little lost, a little stupid at times. And I think that's what Joyce is getting at. And that's not what we're used to when we read, because, we're taught to read for understanding. If you're missing things, you're missing things, and that's a problem. Joyce says, like, here you don't have to do that. Here it's a completely different game. I think bringing that back to read it collectively, yes, both books are unsolvable, but when you've got 10 minds looking at the text together rather than one, you can solve a bit more. And I think people like that, because even when people come to accept that like they're just never going to get all of it, it's still satisfying to get more of it. And yes, you could say that's true with any book. If you read any book with other people, you're going to get other perspectives on it. And I think that's why people are drawn to book clubs. But I think Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake bring it to a new level, because it puts you in this interesting game of mediating the desire to know it all and the acceptance that you're not going to know it all, and that's fine and fun. That's one of the things that people really resonate with. I think as well too, which this kind of taps into both of the points I brought up, is just sort of the kind of stream of consciousness method of reading. We describe like Ulysses as stream of consciousness often, but I think with both Ulysses, but even more so with Finnegan's Wake, they're both that kind of book where you have a lot of these eureka moments very much in the moment of reading, that if you don't mark down, you're going to lose. But even with marking them down, I think, especially with The Wake, there's a certain momentum that you lose if you don't sort of address it and talk about it and think about right then and there. So I think the immediacy of, being able to read the text and immediately say, oh, I see this, this, and this, really works well with both Ulysses and The Wake. I think it's a text where it's more enjoyable. The act of taking notes is more enjoyable than reviewing your notes later on. a week ago, to sort of add on to that, I think the lack of plot as well sort of leads into that, because with normal book clubs, people, they want to talk about a lot of it can be very plot focused, but in Joyce, Ulysses is the book where nothing happens, which I don't think is fully accurate, but that's a whole other thing. And then Finnegan's Wake, it's kind of like, did anything happen? Was this just word salad? So I think too, the fact that like, you're not sitting with a story. Well, you are sitting with a story, but like not in the way that you are with like a regular novel. Right. People want to focus more on the language, and that lends itself more to immediacy.
I'm wondering if it's the same in your research. I've found that actors are very drawn to Ulysses. Episode 1 of our podcast is my friend Tom, who I started a Ulysses book club with many years ago now. He's first and foremost an actor, and he was interested in reading Ulysses because he had performed parts of it on stage, but had no feel for the book as a whole. Joyce considered theater to be like the pinnacle of the written word, so I think there must be some theatricality that's built into it. It also makes me, listening to you guys, considering how most of Irish storytelling and whatnot was all oral traditions until relatively recently. So I wonder if there's some DNA of that or some of that is in Ulysses' DNA, I think is what I'm trying to say. Because it's certainly become an oral tradition. I know when I first read the book, I was given the very pithy advice you must hear Ulysses read out loud in a Dublin accent. And my friend Tom is from Dublin, so, I had the hookup there. But do you think there's any truth to this advice I was given? Or is it... does it just kind of sound good?
I kind of think both. It's, it's one of those things where people, like, I think everyone sort of knows that it's true, but people have, like, necessarily think about why it's true all the time. And also, I'm always torn on the in a Dublin accent part because I'm like, I know that would be, that's authentic. Having been in reading groups where it's read aloud myself and having, observed them for my research, it does add a new element when you've got multiple different accents going. Joyce has this sort of local universal conflict going on in his work where it's like so intensely local and about Dublin, but at the same time, it's so not about Dublin in many ways as well. Yeah, so I do think it is a true thing that I think it's just become sort of a thing that we say and don't always delve into. I find it interesting to, being in the reading group world, both like for my research and then also participating in it just as a participant. It's just so funny how everyone and their mother is so insistent on recommending the RTE recording to everyone, which I do as well. I do the same thing as well because it's great, but it's just like it's such a common thing you encounter in the world of these Joyce communities. Yeah, I think it is a very true thing. I don't know how much we're like sitting and thinking about, well, why is it this way? I don't know if everyone who feels this way has to sit and think about it that way, but I certainly am because it's part of my research. Another thing that kind of gets lost is people, will say you have to hear it, but then sort of don't see any value in also seeing it on the page. Because I think seeing it on the page does matter as well. Yeah. I think the ideal is to, read it out loud from the page or listen to it while you're reading it on the page. Because a lot of things that work orally, the page doesn't matter, but I think the page does matter in Ulysses and definitely matters in Finnegan's Wake.
Okay. One thing that came up while you're talking there in my mind was I do think there's a value to reading it out loud, in part because I found there's really a big difference. Of my first few years of reading Ulysses, I mostly read it with other Americans and then one or two Irish friends that we knew in Portland. Since then, most of the people I knew for the years of doing this podcast were all located in Dublin who are very, very into Ulysses. And I find those are two very different experiences because I know, especially when I first met Dermot, when he was wooing me back in the day, he came to our Blooms Day and read from Ulysses to impress me. And gentlemen, it worked. So, that's some advice there. There were certain inflections. I think it was a reading from Cyclops he read, and there were certain inflections and things in that our little group had just kind of gone over our head, but Dermot picked up right away. Especially Cyclops is so evocative of how the specific way how Dubliners spoke in that era, and I do think there's something about reading it out loud, because I think I was thinking today, would there be a Faulkner reading group where everybody sits and reads out the Sound and the Fury or whatever, and I don't know, I don't think it would be the same, but there is something about the way Joyce writes where it's meant to flow, and I think if you've never read Penelope out loud, you're probably missing things. I would say that. I think even if you are sitting alone in a cave reading Ulysses, you should read Penelope out loud. There really would be something missing without that sort of flow and rhythm and inflection. It helps you can find the punctuation immediately when you're reading it out loud, that in a way that you can do reading it in your head, but it's not as effective to find that. So, and I think for lay people who are reading it, having that extra assist, man, I think, there must be so much anxiety or insecurity or some kind of imposterishness that people feel when they're approaching a book that they know is difficult. So we're kind of queuing up your Joycean difficulting thing here, right? But it is a hard book. It's a difficult book. It's a book that people fear. One of the really common genres of email I get through the podcast is, I always wanted to read Ulysses, but I didn't think I could do it. And now I'm reading it. And, then they give me their 2 cents about whatever it is made them want to write to me. But I think that people get a pre-anxiety about reading Ulysses. And our book group in Portland was called the Ulysses Support Group, because the idea is that we're all here to support each other to do this thing that's kind of intimidating. You're actually studying this. What have you found over the course of your research about this concept of Joycean difficulty, as you put it?
And I'm going to be kind of repeating myself a little bit here. I think people really get that pre-anxiety about Joyce because it's sort of this chicken and egg thing where it's Joyce is difficult because he flies in the face of what we expect while we're reading. But then because of that, we've all told each other that Joyce is difficult. A lot of people just hear Joyce is difficult. they don't know why we think of Joyce as difficult, but that they think of Joyce as difficult because they've been told that. So it's like, it's a combo of things where, you know, like I was saying before, Joyce writes unsolvable texts, and like we've been taught you have to solve the text, and that freaks people out, that there's not a story in the wake, you know, they're not going to know what's going on during Oxen the first time they read it, that kind of thing. But at the same time, that has lent itself to an aura around Joyce that like just exists, and we don't all know why it exists, but we know it exists. And there's also the fact of Joyce being part of the larger modernist canon. We don't just see Joyce as difficult, but we see modernism as difficult, you know, because he's lumped in with Woolf and with Eliot and with Pound, who are all also considered difficult, even to the point when Eliot and Pound were, you know, trying to promote Joyce's work, they were, you know, leaning into it's difficult and that's why it's good. If I remember correctly, the publishers at Random House, when they first started publishing Joyce in the US legally, you know, post Little Review, also leaned into that. So that was a large part of the early marketing around Joyce. You know, it's this kind of combination of like, you know, the text itself does something different than our expectations of what reading is, but then also like since Ulysses came out, there's just been kind of this kind of multi-pronged campaign of like, yes, Joyce is difficult. He's part of this difficult movement of writers. All that, you know, that's just sort of been compounded over the years, I think. And then I think too, you know, the fact that we keep creating tools like podcasts, like things like that to explain Joyce and simplify Joyce, it signals to people that Joyce is difficult. So in trying to demystify Joyce, we mystify Joyce. It's a whole bunch of things. And what I found with reading groups is that, you know, people go into them often with the Joyce is difficult and I have to do this with other people so that I can understand it. They tend to, from what I've seen, they tend to eventually figure out that they're not going to understand it all. And that's when they start enjoying it. And that's when they keep coming back to this. So, you know, overcoming the difficulty of Joyce is not figuring Joyce out. It's figuring out that you don't have to figure out Joyce.
That's nice. That's a nice, like, Zen koan there. A really common question you see online, particularly on Facebook, is what companion text should I use? Is there a tension between people who like think you need a lot of companion text, or people who want to, for lack of a better term, kind of just raw dog Ulysses? And is there something that makes a companion text particularly successful versus not super successful, however you want to define that?
Yeah, so there definitely is a tension, because once people get really into Joyce, they develop opinions about a lot of things.
They sure do.
And I think, I think, you know, a lot of those opinions around companion texts tend to be based on whatever that reader's experience has been. So if, you know, if they went into Ulysses blind, then they're going to be like, oh, well, I did it without anything and I love it, so it's great. But then if someone went into it with a companion text, they're likely to be like, this is the one that you should buy and read. So yeah, there is definitely a lot of tension because there's this sort of like people who are really into the authentic experience, and then people who, even if they understand that like they don't have to understand everything, know that like there are limits to how lost you can feel without putting down the book often if it's just not what you're used to. So yeah, and I think it's something too, it sort of feeds into also the tension between non-academic and academic readers, because a lot of the complaints leveled at academics from non-academic readers is that, oh, they overanalyze everything. They take the fun out of everything, And I think the people who are like, you should not use any companion texts when you start reading it, often kind of sometimes align with that mode of thought that, you know, we can't overanalyze Joyce. Otherwise, it's not fun anymore. In terms of like the quality of companion texts, I think there's a few different things. First two things I would say are just sort of style. So like there are so many of them. As I'm sure you know, Stuart Gilbert sort of started the tradition, and there have been a million of them since for both Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake. They're all very different in sort of their writing style, and whatever writing style clicks with you is probably the best one to use if you're going to use one, because you want something that, you know, makes sense to you, that, you know, makes you want to read. And then also just the logistical issue of like accuracy, because with so many companion texts, there are inevitably mistakes in them. There's also bias you have to consider too, which oftentimes people just pick up the first companion text they see and don't know, like what angle the, writer is writing from. A big one that people point out is like the fact that Stuart Gilbert basically had Joyce over his shoulder when he was writing his. So it's like, you're getting what Joyce wanted you to get, kind of. I wouldn't say that like Gilbert is the key to understanding how Joyce wanted you to read the book. Far from that. Joyce was involved, and this was during the early marketing, and they wanted to sort of make the book feel serious and legitimate, that kind of thing. So that's an important factor. But then another thing, which actually a chapter of my thesis is devoted to this, is how these companion texts actually address difficulty. Because they often do a lot of the same things where they tell you what happens in the book. In case of the Wake, what happens. They tell you some of the major themes, things like that, varies from book to book, but, they'll often explain things like, a free and direct discourse, the Uncle Charles principle, all those like technical terms that we use. So they'll have things like that. But then the ways in which they tell people to deal with the difficulty really vary. And so in reading a ton of these companion texts, which is it's quite a task because you're kind of just reading plot summaries of Ulysses over and over and over again. I sort of found kind of four major approaches that they kind of offer, and these approaches are often sort of blended together, but they'd sort of be like one, the act of sort of accepting that you're not going to understand everything and sort of going along with the terms that Joyce has set. I'd say another one would be, which leads into reading groups, is sort of a collaborative approach where a lot of companion texts will be like, yeah, you should read this with a group. You should read this out loud, that kind of thing. You should, have this be a social experience. For the Wake, a really good example of that is Roland McHugh's book. He really harps on the you should read this with people out loud kind of thing. Say another one would be just sort of what I call the encyclopedic approach, where they're like, hey, you're not going to get everything, but you should try to get as much as you can, and that'll make you feel comfortable. Have the annotations at your side, constantly be in the dictionary, that kind of thing. And then some of them, even though they tell you to read Ulysses or read The Wake, engage in what I call the avoidant approach, where they tell you to just sort of not accept that you don't understand everything, but just sort of skip things, simplify things. Companion texts where they just sort of summarize it and don't really go beyond that, I would kind of say they're giving you Ulysses without all the other stuff. There are a few companion texts that flat out tell you to skip things. This is something I think I talked about in my symposium paper in Daniel Mulhall's Ulysses, A Reader's Odyssey. He fully says, yeah, you can skip Proteus, you can skip Oxen, you don't need them to, have read the book. If they're too hard to skip it, especially Proteus, he says is not necessary to understanding the overall style of the book, but Proteus is where Joyce is really setting up that stream of consciousness, stylistic thing that he's doing. So I would disagree with that. But yeah, so that's the kind of, there's also the it kind of goes weirdly hand in hand with acceptance, where it's again, saying that, oh yeah, you're not going to understand everything, but instead of being okay with that and finding fun in that, it's just let's simplify it. Let's, avoid it altogether. I think another good example of that would be Anthony Burgess's A Shorter Finnegan's Wake, where he cuts Finnegan's Wake in half basically, and is basically oh yeah, so I've selected the best parts of the Wake for you, and in between he summarizes what happens. It's a weird book. I could see some use in if you're scared to read the Wake and you read a little and you're okay, maybe I could just do the whole thing, but why not just buy the Wake then? Bernard Benstock actually has a good review of it, where he's I don't know who this book is for, because it's not for scholars, but it's not for the lay read. There's a lack of an audience. A bunch of different factors with companion text, but I'd say their approach to how to handle the difficulty is really key.
I genuinely don't understand the advice to skip parts, or why are you reading Ulysses or Finnegan's Wake if that's what you're looking at. My position is there's no wrong way to read Ulysses. You might have found the exception to that rule. Don't skip things. This is, preaching to the choir here. It's a Ulysses podcast, but I kind of feel like if that's how you're approaching it, Ulysses may not be the book for you, and that's also okay. Finnegan's Wake probably really isn't the book for you, and that's also okay. I cannot endorse just skipping parts of it. It reminds me of, I think there are people who take Shakespeare and translate it to modern English. And I've heard more debates pro and con for that, but I still feel the same of like, it just may not be Shakespeare that you're looking for, and that's okay.
Yeah.
You don't have to read Ulysses. Like, you'll be all right if most gives you something in common with most people. If you don't read Ulysses, it's fine. But I don't understand the point of not only buying a book to read it, but then buying additional books to help you read it and walking away with, I'm just going to skip the third chapter because it was a bit much.
Going back to, talking about listening to Ulysses, I would say if you're having that much difficulty with Proteus, which is totally fair, like it's, you're sort of thrown into the deep, you're sort of thrown into the deep end of the pool there. Just go and listen to the recording of it.
Yeah.
Because that, it's still like a difficult text, but I feel like that is a way to ease into it, just listening to the recording of it in place of like actually reading it. I wouldn't say it's like ideal. Like I was saying before, like I think if you're listening to it, you should have the text in front of you. Whatever gets you into Ulysses gets you into Ulysses.
Yeah, I'm very much firmly in the camp that listening to an audiobook counts as reading the book. I think especially for people with any kind of accessibility issues, like dyslexia comes to mind. Like I see no problem with someone listening to it, but I just when I hear the just skip Proteus, and Proteus is very near and dear to my heart, is maybe one of my favorite. But that's after 2 years of like meticulously going through line by line, which I don't recommend to anyone. My questions start almost getting existential of like, why are you even reading? It's like, I don't know, it makes me think of like the productivity guys who are like, you can read 3 times as many books if you listen to them on triple speed. And it's like, no.
Yeah.
Did not. So, yeah, I think that's very suspect advice. But again, I think we're probably preaching to the choir here, because if you're not only listening to the Ulysses podcast, but it's supplemental conversations, you're knee deep in it. Like everyone here is going to be like standing up and applauding us right now. So, but yeah, I find that very peculiar advice.
Yeah, and I'm happy to say it's not the norm in Joyce companion text. Like it's not something you find often, but it is there.
There's
like,
something almost
why bother?
Condescending in it too, of just like now I don't like it.
I totally agree. I think with companion texts, there's this genre where sometimes it's like a classic like Joyce scholar writing it, but other times it's someone who's not a Joyce scholar who's just really into Joyce. Authorship kind of varies. I think often the assumption that like the reader just isn't going to get it, or that the reader will find it difficult in the first place, is condescending to the reader, especially the non-academic reader, or even the student reader, because these are really popular with students as well, as you might imagine. Because it's also like we've collectively agreed that Joyce is challenging, and like there is evidence for why he is challenging because of how he aligns with what we do when we read. But also like everyone is a different reader, and there are certainly, I'm sure there are people out there who read Proteus the first time and probably didn't get everything in it, but didn't feel like, oh, this is so difficult. I think assuming what parts people are going to find difficult is a slippery slope, because there are parts that a lot of us agree that like are the difficult parts. At the end of the day, everyone is bringing their own perspective to it. Oxen is difficult for most of us, but if you're really well versed on the history of English literature, it's probably not that difficult the first go around,
Just to look at it from the other way, is there a particularly good companion text? I wrote one of the first posts I ever wrote for our blog years ago was 6 companion texts to Ulysses, because I heard that listicles do better in the algorithm. And that is far and away the most popular thing I've ever written. The things where I spent a month on one post reading 25 different articles, they do all right. The listicle, it's like up here. The people want to know, Zoe. What's the good one? What should they run out and spend their money on?
Oh, so I'd say for Ulysses, even though Gilbert has issues and there are like issues to be aware of with Gilbert, I still think can be a good one to start with just because it's so foundational. I really like the Terence Killeen one, Ulysses and Us. Very new, but I also really like Patrick Hastings is the guide to James Joyce's Ulysses, because like it's very straightforward, and like I feel like has a good balance of bringing in the academic stuff but not feeling academic. The style is like very approachable. I'd say for the Wake, Edmund Lloyd Epstein's guide is very good. I think it's just called A Guide Through Finnegan's Wake, if I remember correctly. That came out in like 2009, I think. But it's very comprehensive. I'd say too, similar to Gilbert, Skeleton Key to Finnegan's Wake by Joseph Campbell, Henry Morton Robinson, again has its issues that are like, once you know about the issues, you're kind of fine. It's, again, one of those sort of foundational, like, yeah, there are issues, things that like modern scholars don't really agree on, but because it's such an influential book, it like is helpful. Anthony Burgess actually, even though I have issues with a shorter Finnegan's Wake, his Rejoice, which is like on, I think on all of the texts, is pretty good. So because there is more of a straightforward companion text guide and not just like a here's half of the wake, have fun. I'd say those ones are quite good.
Okay. Well, thanks for your recommendations. Now, one thing I wanted to ask you about too is what role do these Joycean community groups play in the larger Joycean world? Specifically, like, a big part of the people who spend a lot of time with Joyce's works are academics. If you're in that kind of work, you will have the time and space to focus on something like that. But with such a big lay community, how do they kind of mesh with the professional community?
So I'd say a lot of that is through the fact that Joyce scholars often find themselves in these non-academic reading groups, that kind of thing. Because I think if you're someone who like is really that dedicated to Joyce, you're going to find some extracurricular Joyce stuff to go and do. So yeah, so there are a lot of spaces where the worlds collide in that way. I'd say too, kind of on the other end of it, I think I mentioned before, a lot of non-academic readers in groups will bring in scholarship either to their own reading or to the group itself. So I've noticed a lot with like wake groups, they love to like have McHugh's annotations like ready to go while they're reading, that kind of thing. So yeah, and I also, a big point of convergence is Blooms Day as well. It's another sort of space where like, of course, the non-academic Joyceans are going to be there because like this is, like a hobby interest. But also the scholars are going to be there because, again, even with the fact that it is like a professional scholarly approach, there's a reason that they went into Joyce studies. I feel like a lot of it is just that like they're in the same space a lot of the time, just out of mutual interest.
Okay. Did you mention that there's some kind of tension there, or are they just everybody's kind of happily coexisting? Or
yeah, there definitely is a tension. I'd say on both sides, because sort of on the non-academic side towards the scholarly side, there's that idea that like, oh, they're taking all the fun out of Joyce, they're overanalyzing him, that kind of stuff. They're elitist and gatekeeping. And then on the flip side, Joycean scholars are often hyper aware of like the common mistakes and misconceptions around Joyce, just because, they have to be. And when they see non-academic Joyceans doing that, like they can be critical of them. I think as Joyce scholars, like I personally, interacting with non-academic Joyceans a lot, like, I hear people like, spread the myths or like that kind of thing. And I'm like, I'm not going to judge them for it personally, but not everyone is of that mindset.
What's a Joycean myth that's going to have every professor go like that?
I don't know if I'll have every single professor go like this, but actually it is about professors. The quote where Joyce is saying, like, I've put in so many puzzles and enigmas to keep the professors busy for the next 100 years. He most likely did not say that.
Okay.
But actually, non-academic, like in sort of the non-academic space, that's sort of something people use to like make fun of academics, that, oh, they're just sitting there with their puzzles kind of thing. It's funny because like Joyce probably did not say that. So that, that kind of stuff. There's certain kind of like the kind of like basic well-known stuff about Joyce that we as academics kind of take for granted. Because like, while we're, us academics are all here being like, how important is Homer actually? Like, should we actually be, engaging with the correspondences, a lot of readers just starting out will be like, yes, this is like the Odyssey, and it helps me to see it that way. And I think it's interesting because I think both views are correct, because like seeing it like the Odyssey is very helpful to like first understanding the book. I know like when I first read it, like that was something that was really emphasized for me, and that definitely helped me get into it. But at the same time, like there is an important scholarly conversation to be had of like where does Homer really fit in here, like that kind of thing. Like how best should we be talking about this? I think there's like kind of a mutual misunderstanding of like where both sides are coming from. Because I think from the academic side, it's either like, you know, some, definitely not all, trust me, are like, you know, they'd be judgmental of how non-academic readers talk about the book or think about the book. There's also sort of like the we're aware that like they sometimes look poorly on us for overanalyzing, and we're not happy about that. Because I can say, the idea that the professors do not find Joyce funny or don't see the humor in Joyce is very not true. We're having fun with it too.
I would say too, as a person, like for many people, the analysis is fun.
Yeah, I always find it weird when people get like, oh, you know, they're overanalyzing. I'm like, why is that a problem to overanalyze? Like, just because you're not doesn't mean other people can't, kind of thing, you know?
My feeling hearing that is like, because when you say, oh, the academics are overanalyzing it, like, it's just weird because it's like, well, what do you think academics do? Of course.
Like that's our job.
Right. So I start thinking then maybe that the person who, if it's a genuine critique, like, they're analyzing too much. It's, again, maybe they're talking more about themselves and their own perceived shortcomings or insecurities, or, you know, we often dislike most in other people what we don't like about ourselves, kind of thing. That's a silly thing to complain about.
And I think it also like ties into what we were talking about earlier with like Joyce's reputation for being challenging. You know, a lot of people like feel a lot of hostility towards Joyce for that. That prevents a lot of people from ever starting to read Joyce. And I think culturally, you know, English academics we're the symbol of like all of that difficulty, because we're the ones who are like engaging with those texts a lot. And so we're seen as like they're the ones making it difficult.
They have not read Ulysses or Finnegan's Wake if they think the difficulty is an exterior force. The call is coming from inside the house. They are.
Yeah, well, I do think it is a combination of things, though. Yeah. Like, I think a lot of the interior difficulty of Joyce is, like, Joyce is telling you, like, yeah, it's confusing, get over it. Just, you know, which, like, people don't want to accept. Kind of a tangent, but I feel like it is relevant, too. There's also, I'm sure you've seen this, having an internet connection, people love to like brag about never having read Joyce and like never planning to read Joyce.
Yeah.
Like there's like a badge of honor for some people. I think that's their
Paulo Coelho, who was like, I don't see any need to ever read Joyce, and it's like, all right, calm down, Paulo.
I think so.
Oh, I know it was him. I know it was him. I don't know why I talk like that, but it was, and I was like,
him and like thousands of people on Twitter for some reason.
Oh, really? I don't see those people. The algo must be filtering them away from me.
No. So. I wish it would do the same for me, but no.
No, I get the guys who are like, you were slightly incorrect about something at minute 42:35 of episode 136, and I'm like, okay, I appreciate your feedback. Those are more like the ones who are too into it will get filtered to me, and that's usually okay. I usually like talking to them. Yeah, I think I definitely like our branding for Blooms and Barnacles is a non-academic take on James Joyce's Ulysses. But I mean, I read a lot of academic papers though before I write any of those scripts, so I don't know if that's even true about Blooms and Barnacles. I would say, too, just from my own point of view I always felt like, you know, people in universities that I could never get into are going to not be interested at all in, like, my goofy podcast. But I have been pleasantly surprised by how supportive the people I have reached out to have been. So, and, like, I went to an academic conference this summer and read my paper, and people listened to it, and that was a pleasant surprise, and I was surprised they even let me come talk to them about cheese and things like of that nature. But I would say, though, what I really took away from that experience is that it's a very open and welcoming space. Like, I've had listeners reach out like, oh, do you think, like, would you recommend that or not recommend that? And if you have a thing to say, write it down and see what happens is my recommendation. But I found people to be very open. I think I met one person who was not even bad, just kind of rude to me, and they'd stand out because they were the only one. That was not different than what my expectation would have been. Yeah, no, I found people to be, in general, pretty easygoing, so I think that and like the annotation or no annotation, like a lot of these are false conflicts, like they're meaningless conflicts. People like to pick a side, and I think with something like Ulysses, we've all been in a book group. There's the one guy, sometimes the guy is a girl, but there's the one guy who wants you to know they're the smartest. Maybe I've been this guy sometimes. But they kind of take up too much space, and I think when there's a bigger version of that comes along, people can get scared and nervous and act weird on the internet sometimes. I find too you'll meet people who've sort of taken too personal of an interest in Joyce, like they're the Joyce expert with all capitals, and they don't like other people coming in and saying a different thing than they thought. And I think one thing I like about at least Ulysses, and I'm sure this is true of Finnegan's Wake too, is there's no correct answer. Like, there are more widely accepted answers, but there's no definitive anything. The kind of boilerplate thing you get from all the reading guides is just the starting point. There's always more you can add up or under or sideways or wherever you want. And that, I think, hashing that out with a group of friends and probably a couple pints or cups of coffee if you don't drink is very nice. So the last thing I think most people are listening to this have either been a member of a Joyce community or might want to be, or might want to start a book club. I've had people reach out and ask, how do you start a Joyce book club? I actually had one guy get in touch with me recently and said, I took your advice and our group in Seattle is going great. And that was a wonderful email to receive. So definitely people want to know what are qualities that would make a Joycean community, particularly, a lay group, that would make that a success, and what are things that in your research you think are best to avoid?
Well, it is a bit funny to me that people are asking, how can I start a Joyce group? Because it feels like, you need people, books, and a space to meet. It doesn't even have to be a physical space. Like, a lot of them are on Zoom now, especially post-COVID, because a lot of them went to Zoom and never left. So yeah, it's almost this it is such a simple thing, but it feels like not a simple thing because it's Joyce and it's difficult. I would say, I think it's important to know that, especially if you're reading Joyce for the first time, it's important to know that you're going to be very confused. You're not going to get everything. Everyone's going to be very confused. Something I always ask groups about, and they always give me similar answers, is I ask them about when you're reading Ulysses or reading Finnegan's Wake, there's always going to be a point where you get to a word or a passage where no one has an answer, and maybe this is a group that doesn't use annotation, so they're just kind of we don't know what this means. I ask how do you guys respond to that? How do you feel about that? Is it frustrating? Is it not? A lot of the groups I've seen who are successful groups don't find it particularly frustrating. It's easier said than done to feel totally lost and not be frustrated. So it's really a skill you have to learn to just be okay with what the text is giving you. This applies to reading it on your own as well. But I think it really shines in a group because you've got multiple people on this, is to remember that Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake are very much what you make of them. I kind of like to describe them as choose your own adventure books, where you as the reader are given a far more active role than the conventional novel gives you. You are very involved in creating the book because of the way it's written and the way it's just so difficult to grasp in so many ways. You have to sort of find your own points to grasp. So beyond just being okay with not getting it, you need to step up and become a creator yourself. And I think it's easy and not easy to do that when you're reading it on your own. But in a group, you're going to have conflicting perspectives. And I think it's good to figure out how to find harmony in different things that different people are trying to do with the book. And also, like we said before, reading it out loud is so, so important. So I think too, something I've seen with groups, and then also I've actually read about college classes that will do this as well, is having members of the group present parts of the text to each other, almost like you're in a class, sort of presenting on an episode. kind of giving people homework in a sense. I feel like that's very effective too. Having people take on sort of like a fake teacher role in a way can also kind of help. And switching around that role, not just having like there just be one person, because then it just becomes a class, and then that's not a reading group.
Yeah.
So, a class is not a bad thing, but it's not.
It might not be what people are looking for in that instance.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Zoe. Is there anywhere you would want people to find you online? Do you social medias, or if you'd rather to stay mysterious, or?
I'd rather stay mysterious.
I love it.
Yeah.
All right. All right. Thank you
Right.
so much for joining us, Zoe. All right.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. All right. And cut.